My friend George was dying of cancer. And a friend and I decided that we would go visit him once he had entered palliative care. This wasn't the first time that we'd gone to visit him, and in the previous visits we had largely exhausted the sorts of conversations that happen around a deathbed. But our decision this time was to take one of George's favorite books along and read it out loud to him. That intention was challenged by George's three roommates, the first of whom was watching sports on television, the second who was listening to hard rock on the radio, and both of them had the volume loud enough to drown out the third, a man who was plagued by loud, racking coughs. We began to read, but the combined cacophony of television, radio, and respiratory sickness distracted us, and we stumbled over some of our words, we mispronounced others. George lay there with his eyes closed. Felt like he was concentrating, perhaps, and I wondered if he had drifted off into sleep. And I wondered if he was hearing what we were saying over the discordant din of the room. And then it happened. George opened up his eyes and he said, "Stop. Read that last part again." And you can't refuse a dying man his wish, so we did. The dragon swooped once more lower than ever, and as he turned and dived down, his belly glittered white with sparkling fires of gems in the moon, but not in one place. The great bow twanged. The black arrow sped straight from the string, straight for the hollow by the left breast where the foreleg was flung wide. In it smote and vanished barb, shaft, and feather, so fierce was its flight. With a shriek that deafened men, felled trees, and split stone, Smog shot spouting into the air, turned over, and crashed down from on high in ruin. Smog the dragon was dead, slain by Bard's arrow. And the words, the language of Tolkien's The Hobbit was so evocative, so beautiful to George that it brought tears to his eyes. And it wove a web of illusion that drowned out the noise of the room. We were suddenly transported to Lake Town to see the dragon fall. We were with Bilbo the Hobbit and his dwarven companions. We were absolutely there in that room with George at his bedside. But we were also at the bedside of the dwarven Lord Thorin as he breathed his final breaths. Dragons. Dwarves, hobbits, utter make-believe. Not a fact in sight, furthest things from facts, to be sure. Celebrated science fiction and fantasy writer Ursula K. Le Guin said that a novelist's business is lying. A novelist's business is lying, and in a world of fake news, why would anyone want to concern themselves with lies, even beautiful ones like the ones in The Hobbit? Especially on their deathbed. After all, we're a society that reduces the power of beautiful lies, the beautiful lies of story, with that common English phrase, "It's just a story." It's just a story, it's made up. If a child is terrified by something like the big bad wolf, we will say to them, "Don't be afraid. It's just a story." But the fear that the child feels is real. Emotions are real. We used to think of them as this ephemeral thing somewhere outside of ourselves, something that we could sort of wish or will away. But what neuroscience is teaching us is that emotions are visceral. They are physiological. What this means is that if a story makes you cry, you're really sad. If a story makes you laugh, you are genuinely happy. Now think about that for a second. That made-up thing just made you feel something real. If I go to a Stephen King adaptation on screen and am terrified, it doesn't matter how ridiculous that murder clown might seem by the light of day, The terror that I feel while watching it is real. It might just be a story, but it's a story that produces real fear. A New York Times article has noted that the brain, when we're reading, does not differentiate largely between events that we read about and events that we would actually experience. In both cases, real or read, the same neurological regions are stimulated. Story, like Bard's bow, shoots out an arrow of stimulus, and when it hits its target, our response to the imaginary is anything but. Now, it's not just emotions that are real when we read or watch or experience a story. It's also the pleasure of that experience that is real. We have a phrase that we use. We want to curl up with a good book. There's a connotation of intimacy, like that book is a good friend or a dear loved one. That's an odd thing when you think about it, that we would talk about something that we say it's only a story by saying we really want to curl up with that thing and enjoy the pleasure of experiencing it. But we don't talk much about the pleasure of reading, at least not in a valorized way. To talk about the pleasure of reading, when you say if reading is pleasurable, that's a lower form of reading. The best forms of reading are the reading of deep meaning, books with deep meanings. And so we treat our good books. I really enjoy a good book. Have you read any good books lately? We treat our good books like the good book. We read sacred texts largely for deeper meaning. And we read a lot of other books that way as well. We have trained ourselves to believe that this is the best form of reading that there is. And yet the dollars and cents of the publishing industry, insofar as fiction, shows the lie of that statement. The number one fiction genre is romance. We want to feel love. Number two, crime thrillers. We want to feel a sense of danger, or maybe the mystery of it all. And numbers 3, 4, and 5 are my wheelhouse. Science fiction, fantasy, and horror, depending on what list you look at. Literary fiction, the fiction of deep, meaningful ideas, is in so much trouble financially in the UK right now that the British government is looking at subsidizing it. So we say we want to read for deeper meaning, for the stories that change the world, but we often read for what makes us feel something, what brings us pleasure. It's tough to want to teach about reading for pleasure or for feeling. It's easier to talk about the deeper meanings, the things that might change the world. But it's not that the reading for pleasure or the reading for feeling doesn't change the world. It's just that it changes it differently than mounds and mounds and mounds of deep meaning books might do, the stories that are really, really deep at some foundational level. We read for the effect of reading, for the emotive effect or the pleasure of reading. We do get changed. Our brain changes in those emotional reactions, and the change comes individual by individual. Emotional response by emotional response, changing my one story, potentially one story at a time. Nevertheless, it's difficult to argue for teaching beautiful lies, for reading beautiful lies, while the sciences are looking for a cure for cancer. There's always a sense in which it feels like we're not doing anything all that important. We're not curing cancer in this room, I will often say to my students. And yet, in his last days on this very real earth, George chose to live at least part-time in a completely imaginary world. And that experience of reading The Hobbit, and then once we were finished, moving on to the Fellowship of the Ring, and he made everybody who visited him during that time read to him from those books. That experience, more than any other that I've had, taught me that fiction is the beautiful lie that lifts us out of the mundane. A good story can make us forget that we are brokenhearted, broken in spirit, or just plain broke. We might forget, in the midst of a good story, that we are at death's door. And if that's all that story does, then it's precious. No, stories can't cure cancer. For the time being, neither can science. So while we wait for the cure, let us read, let us watch, and let us change our minds, one story at a time. Thank you.